This is what we believe as Christians, that God came and became one of us. Now, the question for us is, why would God do that? Why would God do that? Why do we as Christians believe that it happened? And what are we supposed to do because of why God did it? So what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time today looking at it, and we're going to explore. There are many different answers, and all of these answers together overlap to create this round, you might even say 360-degree picture of what God was doing when He sent Jesus into the world. And we're going to only look at a couple of these things. They complement each other. They don't contradict each other in any way. But there's a special reason that we're going to look at them today, which is on our Good Friday. So let's just take a few minutes to look at it and try and understand, why did God become one of us? And what does it mean for all of us that are here that God became one of us? We're going to start by talking about a guy named John. Now, what we understand is that when you look through the Bible in the New Testament, there are 4 eyewitnesses, 4 people who write what we call the Gospels. And these are the eyewitnesses. John, and John was the one who had been with Jesus from the very beginning, and John is the only one of them who didn't die a death of martyrdom in the end. And then there's Matthew, who is also one of the people who was worked along with Jesus. He was also eyewitness. There's Mark, who personally was an eyewitness for much of it, but Mark is also the companion of Simon Peter, and so he saw a lot of it himself, and what he didn't see Simon Peter explain to him. So through Mark, you get Peter's perspective. And then there's Luke, and for all of us who are following the Gospel of Luke, this week we read Luke chapter 9. Next week we're all going to read Luke chapter 10. And well, let me just ask this question. How many of you here are reading along with me every week and following along? You read Luke chapter 9 this week, and you're going to read Luke chapter 10 next week. Raise your hand. Oh, that's it. I'm done. Now, I got to admit, it's hard because one chapter of the Bible will take you almost 10 minutes to read, and ask you to spend 10 minutes reading the Bible once a week. That's pretty rough. I mean, that works out to like a minute and 15 seconds a day. Anyway, so here we go. This is an eyewitness account, and this is what it says. John starts off his story about Jesus, his eyewitness account, by saying, the Word, and that's metaphorical language, that's symbolic language. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So at the very beginning, the very foundation of everything that John saw and experienced 3 years traveling with Jesus, John was the only one who was standing at the foot of the cross looking up when Jesus was crucified. And he saw Jesus resurrected, and he saw Jesus go back up to heaven. And when he wants to tell the whole story, he starts right here. The Word became flesh, Jesus became flesh, and dwelt among us. I like that word, dwelt. You see that? That's why we have it in yellow highlights, for those of you who haven't figured it out yet. That word actually means pitched a tent among us. I was going to actually claim that we put the tent out in the lobby because of that, but it's really from the missions thing. In fact, we had a visitor from that doesn't go to IES, and they came here the other day, and they said, that's interesting, a tent. I wonder what the symbolism is of that. Sorry, no symbolism. It's just an object lesson. But God came and lived among us, and we saw His glory. Who's the we? Who's the we in this story? The we is John, who wrote it. The we is Andrew. The we is James. The we is Peter. The we is Matthew. All of these eyewitnesses, this is what they actually saw. We saw His glory, the glory of the only begotten from the Father, the one and only, the unique, the only existing Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, the question we want to ask is, why did He come as one of us and live as one of us among us? Why? Why did that happen? Now, first of all, what you need to understand is that when this happened 2,000 years ago, this idea of God coming down and living amongst man, it was unique. Nobody else had this idea. This was not something that was common. Nowadays, because of what Jesus did, it shows up in ideas. People will say, somebody, is a living God, all this kind of stuff like that. Every now and then somebody buys an advertisement in the New York Times or whatever and says so-and-so is, But in those days, it wasn't that way at all. All religions actually were going the other direction. Man becomes God. If you know your Greek mythology, you understand that the Greek gods and the Roman gods, which is the same gods with different names, They lived up there, and they came down and they wandered amongst people. They were liars, they were cheaters, they were stealers, they were adulterers. Not a really, really good group of people. And they would go in, and maybe they would disguise themselves so that they could do mischief amongst them. And gods came down and as gods, but the idea was for people to go up. This was a big thing for the Romans. Julius Caesar was one of the first ones that was deified. After he died, the Roman government, the Roman Senate, declared that he was deified. And by the time this is happening, that John is writing this, these Roman emperors, these Roman Caesars, are becoming to be declared God while they're still alive. And it's really a big deal. So the whole idea is moving up. But what John is talking about is that Jesus moved down. He came down and became one of us. A completely unique idea. Now, why? What was God doing? Like I said, we're going to look at two really important related ideas when we discuss this today. And the first of them actually comes from what Jesus said to his disciples. So John and these other guys, they were with Jesus. They followed him. When he walked along a path, they either followed him or they walked alongside of him. He explained things to them. He shared things together. They did all these things together. And now it's near the end of the time. Now remember what's happened. We're going to be reading a part of this John story. God is dwelling with us. His name is Jesus, the Word made flesh. And now Jesus has come into Jerusalem in this amazing triumph where the whole city's standing outside and cheering for him and everything else. And he's gathered together his disciples. And when he gathers together his disciples, he talks to them. He encourages them. He says wonderful things about how much he loves them. He washes their feet. He's just the most amazing rabbi anybody's ever had. And as they're sitting there and they're waiting for the inside scoop, like something like, when do we take over the country and when do we get to be important? He says, oh yeah, and by the way, I'm leaving. And all of a sudden there's this sense of discomfort in this group because he's talking about leaving. Now you got to understand that for the most part, these guys are fishermen who were never important in their life until they got to hang out with Jesus. And from their little fishing villages, now they're in the capital, and people pay attention to them because they were with Jesus. They were all, just to give you an example, they were all Galileans. They all spoke with the same accent. And so when they said something, people would say, oh, yeah, maybe you're like with that guy Jesus. In fact, that happens in a little bit, but Peter's not too happy about it, actually. And he says, I'm leaving you. And when he says that, they don't want to agree. They think, you've got something wrong here. That must not be going on. In fact, Peter even says, I don't want you to go, and if you go, I'm going with you, because wherever you go, I'm going to be with you. No matter what, I'll stay with you to the end. And Jesus says, Peter, I hate to tell you this, but that's not really what's going to happen. And then Jesus says these things. You're all upset because I've told you I'm going to leave, but listen to this. Don't let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. Now, the disciples are already a little confused. And then Jesus throws this one out here. Don't let your hearts be troubled. How can we not be worried? You're leaving us. You're our ticket to power and glory, and now all of a sudden you're saying you're going to leave us. And then he says, you believe in God, believe also in me. Well, of course they believe in God. They're devout Jews. But Jesus introduces this thing where he's saying, just like you trust in God, trust in me. Well, why should we trust in you? You're leaving. What's that all about? Believe in God, trust also in me. And then he makes this beautiful statement that to you and I, we enjoy it, but it might have been kind of confusing to them. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And they're saying, wait a minute. You're here, and then you're going, and you're going to the Father's place, but you're going to prepare a place for us. And they're starting to look around the table and saying, do you know what he's talking about? I forgot my mic's on this side. Do you know what he's talking about? Because they can't really follow this all along. You're here, but you're going someplace else, but it has something to do with us. And then he says, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and I will take you to be with me so that you may be where I am. This is profound, but it's also confusing. Okay, Jesus, you're here with us now, and you're going to go, but you're going to go because you're going to do something else, and then you're going to come back and get us, and you're going to take us, and then you're going to take us over there. Is there a different way we can do this? Like, somebody's thinking, what if you just don't go? Just stay here with us. That looks good. We like it the way it is now. We're popular. We can go and ask somebody to borrow their donkey, and they let us borrow the donkey. We can go to somebody and say we need a room, and they let us have the room. We like this. Don't go. Somebody else says, if you're going to go, why don't you just take us with you now? It sounds good. I want to have my own home, so, take me with you now. But they want to know what's exactly going on. So he says, I'm going to take you with me so that where I am, you also may be there with me. And then he says this, and by the way, you know the way to the place where I'm going. Look at each other. Got to remember which one my mic is on. Do you know what he's talking about? Is he going back to Galilee? Is he going someplace else? Are we heading up to Rome? Are we getting on a boat and taking over? Is he going to become the new emperor? What's really going on? And finally, Thomas speaks up for everybody, and he says, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how are we supposed to know how we get there? Have you ever felt that way? For all the ladies in the crowd, have you ever been riding someplace with your husband in the car? And you say, we're supposed to go like this place, and you say, would you just ask somebody? And he'll say, no, I can find it. Because men believe that if we know where we're going, we can find the way. Well, Thomas is a little confused, and he said, look, we don't really know where this is, so since we don't know, how are we supposed to know the way? Because if we're going to be there with you, we need to know what's going on. And Jesus answers him. It's nice to know that Jesus is always going to answer, but Jesus doesn't answer the way he expects. Jesus says, oh, I'm the way. Okay. Let's run this by again. You're here, but you're going to go, then you're going to come back, and you're going to take us to be with you. So we're all going someplace, and now we want to know what's the route. What's the route? Oh, Jesus says, I'm the route. See, we metaphorize this. We make this literal speech, or we make this figurative speech so much, but Jesus is literally saying, I'm the way. It's not a path. It's not a freeway. It's not a direction. It's not a plane that you get on. I am the way. In fact, he expands on it. He says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And then he makes this great big statement. He said, no one goes to the Father except through me. Now, let me just say something parenthetically for you here. I know that not everybody here who's here today is really made a decision to follow the Christian religion. If you don't want to look at it in terms of religion, I know that everybody here isn't really following Jesus. And there are probably a lot of reasons that some of you don't want to follow Jesus. And let me just say to you, in all honesty, if you're not going to follow Jesus, this right here is the very best reason not to follow Jesus. Yeah? It's no one comes to the Father except through me. That's what Jesus says. And for some of you, you're going, man, that's really arrogant. I mean, how can anybody claim to be the only way to the Father? Now, there are other reasons that some of you might not be following Jesus. Some of you might not be following Jesus because you don't want to have to change your way of life. And let me say to you, that's not a good enough reason. Some of you might not be following Jesus because you know that if you start following Jesus, you have to change some of your behavior. You say, well, Pastor Dave, it's not that I don't believe in Jesus, it's just that I don't want to change. And let me say to you, that's not a good enough reason. Some of you are, lying, stinking, dishonest, cheating, and you don't want to stop doing those things. And so you're not ready to follow Jesus. That's not a good reason not to follow Jesus. But if you'll tell me, come on, Pastor Dave, I just can't accept that. I can respect that reason except for one thing. What if he's telling the truth? Before you decide that you're not going to follow Jesus because all ways lead to the Father, you better think about it and ask, what if it's right? All ways lead to God, right? Everybody knows that in the modern days, right? It's just like every road goes to Bandung. Right? Every road goes to Bandung. If you get on a road heading towards Anyer, you'll end up in Bandung if you go far enough, right? Every plane goes to Singapore. If you go to the airport and you get on a plane, every plane will go to Singapore. Well, it might go to Surabaya first. It might go to Bali. It might go to Sydney. But sooner or later, every plane is going to go to Singapore. No, actually, you can't even say that anymore. I was going to say, you could say that sooner or later, every plane goes to Seattle because it gets to go back to Boeing and get fixed. But some of you ride on Airbus. Where does that come from? I mean, sorry, I'm from Seattle. If it's not Boeing, I'm not going, But listen to this. This is hard to swallow in our modern world. And people say, if you say that Jesus is the only way to the Father, you're arrogant. And let me respond to that, by the way, in saying, if you say Jesus is not the only way to the Father, you're arrogant. Because what makes your opinion better than his opinion? But if you don't want to follow Jesus, let me ask you this question. Why did he say that? Why is it that way? That's what we're going to look at. Why did God do this? Jesus says to them, if you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. And Philip says, wait a minute. Lord, show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us. In other words, Philip's saying, come on, enough with this figurative language. Go here, go there, Father's house. If you see me, you've seen him, blah, blah, blah. Just show us God. That's enough. We don't want to be theologians. We're just fishermen. Just show us the Father, and that'll be enough. And Jesus says to him, don't you know me, Philip? After such a long time, I've been among you such a long time. Don't you really know who I am? Don't you really understand? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? This is leading up to this first important statement, or first important reason, that God became one of us. That God planted himself. That God pitched his tent among us. The first and important reason is because that's how we get to see the Father. Jesus said, don't you believe I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, if you want to know what God says, listen to me. Jesus said, my words are not my own words, they're God's words. If you want to know what God says, listen to me. Rather, he says, it's the Father living in me who's doing his work. If you want to know what God is up to, watch me. Sometimes people come to me and they say, Pastor Dave, I want to understand about Christianity and I want to understand about what the Christian thing says. I'm going to read the Bible. And as soon as I hear somebody say, I'm going to read the Bible, I say, get a good New Testament. Because they're usually going to start in Genesis. And Genesis is an interesting place to start. And it's a fascinating place to start. But after they go through Genesis, Exodus, they're going to get trumbled down in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. And, those are wonderful books. And you should read them. I'm not discouraging you from reading them. But that's not how to learn about God. The best way to learn about God is to learn about Jesus. If you want to know who God is, if you want to know what God is up to, watch me. That's what Jesus said. That's why I tell people, read Matthew, read Mark, read Luke, read John. In fact, I should go to the Bible Society and say, just give me little 4 Gospels. So every time I talk to somebody, I can say, here, read these 4 books and read them again and again and again and again until you can tell me what God is like. Because Jesus said, if you want to know God, if you've read about me and you've heard about me, if you know the things I do and you know the things I say, then you know the things God does and you know the things God wants to do. You remember that, Ibu Setiawati? I couldn't resist looking at you. We had that conversation a number of years ago, didn't we? And after she read it, she said, I think I know who God is now in a way I never knew before. Now, this is important for us to understand. This critical reason that it's important for you to grasp this idea of what Jesus said. Jesus didn't say, I don't want anybody to go to the Father except for me, so I'm going to keep people from going to the Father. I didn't want anybody to go to the Father in any other way, so I'm making it hard to get to know the Father. No, what actually Jesus is saying is, the only way to know the Father is through Jesus, who is able to communicate and to demonstrate what God is like. The reality is that we as human beings are not going to be able to sort out all the different ways of thinking to find out who our Creator is. So our Creator came and lived among us so that we would be able to see who He was. Jesus did not claim to have the best explanation of God. Now, this is like a theological contest. How do you explain God? Well, God is omniscient and omnipresent and omnipotent, and people have all these different things. In fact, I really enjoy people telling me, well, I've thought a lot about God, and I think God is like this. And I think to myself, I'm sure God is thrilled that you've decided to figure out what He's like. Because I'm sure God is up in heaven waiting for you to make up your definition so He can figure out who He is. Jesus didn't claim to be the best explanation of God. Jesus claimed to have the best explanation of God. Jesus claimed to be the best explanation of God. Do you understand the difference? Do you get it? Now, sometimes people say, come on, Pastor Dave, that doesn't make any sense. What Jesus is saying is the only way we can know the Father and have a relationship with the Father is to have a relationship with Him. Aren't there many other ways that we can know the Father? Well, there are some ways, but let's just take a minute to take a look at them, okay? First of all, we can look at our circumstance. In fact, that's what Christians are really good at. You know, Christians are always like analyzing everything and you know, they say, that was a God moment. Or that was a God thing. What is a God thing? You know, I mean, seriously. I know who God is and I know what a thing is, but what's a God thing? It's one of those things that Christians put together that make everybody go, huh? What's that all about? See, the problem is we can't really interpret our circumstances and use our circumstances to tell us of what God is because our circumstances are so confusing. Our ability to interpret the circumstances of our life is terrible. Now, I went to Bible school. And you go to Bible school, you learn about the Bible, you learn about how to be a pastor, you learn about how to be a teacher, you learn how to be a missionary. And one of the most important things that happens to you when you go to Bible school, and everybody here who's ever been to Bible school knows it, is you find the person you're going to marry because you're going to marry somebody from Bible school so you can be a pastor, or teacher, or preacher, evangelist, whatever. Now, this created all kinds of problems because, you know, if you're a guy, you're looking for a certain combination of things. Oh, okay, because you're a guy, she's got to be pretty, okay? You're a guy, she's got to be pretty. And because you want to be a pastor, she's got to be spiritual. She's got to love the Lord. She's got to want to be a pastor. That means she has to learn how to play the piano so she can lead the songs, you know, all that kind of stuff like that. And then every year when the new students come in, all the senior guys, because they're going to graduate and they're going to go look for jobs in churches, and they got to have a wife when they look for a job, right? And so when the new school year starts, the senior guys all stand up on the hill and watch as the new girls come in and go in and out of the dorm. And they spot these girls, and then they begin to ask questions like, can she play the piano? Can she sing? You know, all those kind of things. Can she cook? The problem is they spot these girls, and then they begin to pray. Lord, she's the one for me. She's the one for me. Now, how do you interpret circumstances in that case? I mean, what do you do when you got 5 guys praying about one girl? And, you know, how does that really work? In fact, if you would talk to most of the guys I went to school with, they would say, you remember so-and-so? We were all praying that we'd marry her. Have you seen her lately? Thank God didn't answer our prayers, you know? I mean, you know, something like that, you know? And that's the problem. We can't interpret circumstances. We can't use circumstances to tell us anything about God because we don't know how circumstances are going to work out. Now, one of the other ways that we can find out what God's like is we can look at our religious traditions. And you have your religious traditions, and I have my religious traditions. And even if you've been a Christian of one form or another, you come from one of several branches of Christianity. There's the Roman Catholic tradition, there's the Orthodox tradition, there's the Protestant tradition, and even in the Protestant traditions, there's so many other kinds of traditions. And I come from a particular branch that's called the Pentecostal Church. I am what's called a classic Pentecostal, which meant when I was growing up, we weren't allowed to do anything fun. You know, because, you know, you had to make sure that you weren't unspiritual. You were afraid that if Jesus came back while you were doing something wrong, you wouldn't get to go to heaven, you know, and all those kinds of things like that. Well, there's a problem with religious traditions because we all have different religious traditions. So how can we find out what God's really like when we have these different traditions? Religious traditions, everybody has religious traditions, but the problem with traditions is traditions systematize God, they customize God, they overemphasize certain aspects, and they fossilize things. Sometimes, I'll be honest with you, sometimes I sit down with some of my friends who are Protestant friends, who on paper, they believe exactly the same things that I do. And I discovered that we're so far apart in the things that we believe in. I believe that they've systemized it beyond recognition, and they believe, man, Pastor Dave's customized it. He's a Pentecostal. Because he's a Pentecostal, he thinks all kinds of crazy things happen. He thinks that he can hear God speak to him. Man, why would you want to be a Christian if you couldn't hear God speak to you? But anyway, I better not take advantage of my side, yeah? So religious traditions are not going to take us really far in understanding who God is because our religious traditions are all very different. And every religious tradition, if you're going to quote me on something, every religious tradition, every Christian Protestant tradition does some of these things. Systematizes, customizes, overemphasizes, and fossilizes. There are religious traditions where they say, oh no, well Jesus said this and Jesus said this, but he didn't mean this and he doesn't mean this. And they decide all those things. We're not going to be able to find out what God's like by our religious traditions. Here's the one that comes to us in our part of the world. We're going to look within to find God. Look within to find God. Yeah, you know what the problem with that is? The problem is the within is limited to what's within. Yeah? You're not going to be able to find anything else. And the within is limited to what's going on. I mean, seriously, are you going to look within to find God? If you're going to look within to find God, are you going to find it on the within from when you were 3 years old? Or the within when you were 12? Or the within when you were 20? Or the within when you were 40? Or the within when you were 60? That's the different whole sets of withins. You have different perspectives and everything else. If you're going to tie all these things about God together based on how you feel, how you think, and what's inside of you, you're never going to have any consistent idea of what God's like. It applies to a lot of other things too. You say, well, I believe that our emotions come from God, and so, God, we can learn a lot about God about our emotions. Well, really? Because your emotions don't necessarily come from God. For most of us, our emotions come from whether we had a good sleep last night or not. How much coffee did we have this morning? I can look out there because it's kind of dark and you don't think I can see you, but I can see you. And I can see the ones who are like this. You're the 3 coffee people. And I can see the ones who are like this. You're the ones who were going to get Starbucks when you got here and you didn't know it was closed. And so, you're just barely surviving. When you look within you, it's going to depend on a lot of different things. I got one. I love this. One of my favorite things as a pastor is doing weddings and premarital counseling, okay? So every now and then I get this and I get all this data and I'm looking at the couple. They're sitting in front of me and it says, she comes from this family and blah, 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 blah. And he's one of 3 or 4 boys, no sisters. Oh, boy. That's going to be real interesting, So we talk about different things, and, the differences that sometimes relate to gender and everything. And then somewhere along the line, I say to the guy, I don't know if you realize this, but for the rest of your life, much of your happiness and much of what's going to be going on around you is determined by a 28-and-a-half-day cycle. And the guy says, oh, I know all about that. I studied biology. And I say, no, you don't know all about that. You don't have a sister. You don't know anything about that at all. And I've had guys tell me, oh, come on, Pastor Dave, is that really that big of a deal? Are you kidding? When I hear that question, I say, I'll see you after the wedding. I not only do but I also do post-marital counseling, yeah? Your hormones affect it. Your hormones affect what's within you. You can't find God from within you. And finally, we get this one. We're going to look to nature. Because in nature, we can find all these things about God. Like we look into space and we understand the greatness of God and the grandeur of God. And there's some truth in that, but it's really hard to interpret nature because nature doesn't give us a clear lesson. Let me try and give you an example. One of the things that is so much fun for me, when I come back from having gone someplace else, I love coming home to Jakarta. Because Jakarta's been my home now for like 26 years. It's been gracious to us. Our family's been wonderfully rejoiced to live in this place, and our life is here and everything else. But I like to come at night. You know why? Because when you fly into Jakarta at night, it's beautiful. If you fly in the daytime, not so much. Yeah? So you're flying in at night and you're coming in and it's all dark down below, and then you begin to see these little sparkling lights and, oh, these are fishing boats, and everything. Oh, they look like diamonds on a sea of velvet. Ooh, wasn't that poetic? I just made that one up. And it just looks really, really good. If it's daytime, you're going to see a lot of muddy water and a lot of run-down little boats out there, right? And you get closer to the city and you see these ribbons of red and white. It's beautiful. Everywhere you look, the Indonesian flag, right? It says these ribbons of red and light. And you see all these sparkling lights all over. If you come in at daytime, you see a traffic jam, all the cars backed up, and you see a bunch of run-down buildings. Nature, we think we can see things about God in nature, but we can't really. You know why? Because the problem with nature is about survival of the fittest. There's absolutely no grace in nature. There's a great story, and I got to be honest with you. This is such a good story that I looked really hard to find it on the internet, and the internet knows everything. And I couldn't really find it, so I got to be honest with you. This story may not be true, but I'll tell it to you because it's such a great illustration, and I'll tell it to you exactly how it was told to me. The story goes like this. You remember the Exxon Valdez accident? So there's this tanker that's going along, and it's full of all these oil, and for a bunch of different circumstances, it smashes up, and all this oil, huge amount of oil, gets spoiled in this wonderful part of Alaska where there's all these animals, and it's just a horrific mess. And so everybody responds, and the people come, and they do all these things together, and one of the things they do is they find all the animals that have been impacted. Now, we're learning about God from nature, right? They find all the animals that have impacted, and they try and do all these things to protect the crustaceans and the salmon and all these other things like that. And they find these birds, and they've got to clean up these birds. And they've got this one duck that's badly impacted, oil all over it, so they call in all the duck scientists. And they find this hawk, and it's also impacted, and so they find all the bird scientists, the hawk scientists, they've got all these scientists, and they work with these animals. They bring in the things so that they can remove the oil, and they bring in the things so they can restore the stuff on the feathers, and they work with these animals, and they work on this massive, and they spend thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars on this duck and this bird, because it's representative of the destruction, and they want to prove we can clean up after this. So they have this big event. They gather all the people together, and they bring in all the cameras, and we've worked so hard to restore and everything else. And first they take this duck, and they put the duck out in the water, and the duck swims. Duck thing, going out there, quacking, splashing, and the duck is okay, and everybody's really, really happy. And then they take this hawk, and they take the hawk, and they throw the hawk up in the air. And then cameras are on it, and the hawk begins to fly. Soar, beautiful bird. And it keeps circling, going up and up and up and up, and everybody's just rejoicing. In spite of all these terrible things, we were able to restore all these things. And look, and it's soaring up there, and all of a sudden it goes, tucks its wings in, dives down like that, like a dive bomber, hits the duck and kills the duck and flies off with the dead duck. It's just being a hawk. That's what it does. It's survival of the fittest. It's survival of the fittest. You're not going to learn about God, because if God is like nature, we're all in trouble. Yeah? So why in the world did Jesus come? Jesus came because he wanted to communicate and demonstrate to us what God is really like. And that's the most important reason that Jesus said, you can't come to the Father except by me, because you can't understand God on your own. But when you know me, you'll understand what God is like. Not completely. None of us here will ever know God completely. We can study the Bible. We can listen to all the religious things. We will never, in our finite minds, understand an infinite God. But what we can understand of him is what he revealed to us. And what he revealed to us was himself. And that's why we can know him. Now, there's one more. There's one more thing that we want to understand. And the one more thing that we want to understand comes out of a figure of speech, or something that Jesus talks about that's not, when I said the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, most of you kind of heard that phrase before. When I said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, most of us have kind of heard that phrase before. But there's another phrase that we find in the Bible, and it comes up in this book of Hebrews chapter 2, and there's 2 or 3 other places where it occurs. But the phrase or the idea is that Jesus is the older brother of all of the people that God is dealing with. Now, one of the interesting things to me is about in society is about this role of older brothers and older brothers and older sisters too in most societies in Asia. In Asia, it's a very specific thing. I remember when I was in the Philippines and I'm studying the Tagalog language, and I have an extreme motive for studying Tagalog because I've met this amazing girl, and I want to try and court her in Tagalog a little bit if I can. So my motives are, like I'm always telling my teacher, tell me how to say romantic things in Tagalog. It worked. She's married to me now, and she's back there somewhere like that. But when I was trying to learn these things, there were things that I didn't really understand. So we'd be talking, and we'd be doing things like that, and then they'd say, there's this word, and I'd say, well, what does this word mean? It means older brother. Oh, so all your brothers, you use the word kuya. No, only older brother. Well, that's strange. I mean, what's the word in English for older brother? Older brother, right? What's the word in English for older sister? Older sister. Yeah? What's the word in English for younger brother? Younger brother. I mean, in our American society, for the most part, birth order doesn't really matter, right? You're siblings together. You're all together. In the Philippines, it's kuya. And when you call somebody kuya, It's wonderful, it's loving, and it also means they're your boss. Yeah? Because the older sibling has a certain role in society. We do the same thing here in Bahasa Indonesia, kakak, but it's not gender specific. And this is the understanding that we find in this situation. That Jesus is talking about all of us being his brothers and sisters. And he's taking this role as the older brother. And this is what's important for us on this day. He says this, both the one who makes people holy, he's the one who makes people holy by dying on the cross, and those who are made holy, that's you and I, we're made holy, we're of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Did you know that? Did you realize that Jesus calls you a brother and a sister? And then he says this, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. In the assembly, I will sing your praise. Now, that saying, I'm going to declare the name of God. In other words, I'm going to reveal God to my brothers and sisters. And that's not a really profound statement, but if you want a little extra credit here, let me just tell you that particular statement is a quote from Psalm 22, and it comes from Psalm 22, verse 22. And Psalm 22, verses 1 through 21, is a psalm that talks about how God's servant, God's Messiah, will suffer and die. So this is your extra work for those of you who like to research. Go read Psalm 22 on Good Friday and read about what Jesus is quoting. Jesus is saying, yeah, I'm going to die, I'm going to suffer, but in all of these things that I'm going to go through, I'm glorifying God to all of my brothers and my sisters. And then he goes on to say, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil. By this reason. And then he goes on to say, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Fear of death. Fear of death. It's the single most universal thing that we have, the fear of death. Almost everybody fears death. The reason we fear death is because we don't know what's beyond it. But what Jesus promises us is that he can take us, his brothers and sisters, because he was made like us, because he became one of us. He has the ability to take us to the Father that nobody else can. And in taking us to the Father, we have an opportunity to have freedom from all the consequences of death. We don't have to be afraid. It doesn't impact. And get this. For this reason, he, that's Jesus, had to be made like them. The them is us. Fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered, and when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Okay, why did Jesus come to earth? Number one, Jesus on earth is the only way that you and I are ever going to understand God. We're not going to find God by looking within ourselves. We're going to find confusion. We're not going to find God by looking at nature. We're going to find survival of the fittest. We're not going to find God by looking to religious traditions, because religious traditions, although they are necessary, they're inconsistent. We're not going to find God by looking at circumstances, because you and I don't have the capacity to know whether something's good or not when it happens. We might not know for a week, we might not know for months, we might not know for years. The only way we're going to find God is by looking to Jesus. But more than that, Jesus goes on to say, look, you guys, I am your older brother. I became like you so that I can take the role of bringing you to the Father. How many of you remember, there was a movie that played a number of years ago. I didn't like the movie. I found it very discouraging, but it was called A River Runs Through It. You remember that movie? That was the famous movie because that was the first real starring role that Brad Pitt had. And when I'm saying, you guys remember the movie A River Runs Through It? A lot of the guys are like, something about cowboys. And all the women are going, oh yeah, Brad Pitt. I remember that movie. That's a really sad movie because it's about two brothers who become more and more and more and more distant from each other. And when the critical time comes in the younger brother's life, his older brother can't save him anymore because they have become distant. It's the opposite of the Jesus story. Jesus becomes the older brother in our life so that when the critical time comes in our life, he can take us and he can bring us to the Father. He can not only bring us to the Father, but he plays that role. It's referred to in here, that role of being like an intermediary or being like a priest. He can play that role because when we're tempted, he was tempted too, and yet he was able to overcome it. So he can take us by the hand and say, this is how you take it. This is how you make it. And this is what it all happened when he died on the cross for us. This is why God became one of us. And when he became one of us, he was Jesus.